Okay, hi everybody. Daniel Karapkin here from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit for webyeshiva.org. We are studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim, and we are getting very close towards the end of the Sefer. We're now in section 3, chapter 46. We stopped off right around the middle of the chapter last time, and we're going to be picking up with the Rambam's discussion overall in this entire section of Ta'amei HaMitzvot, the reason why God gave us the commandments, which was for the sake of perfecting the human being, to provide him with the highest level of humanity that he has the capacity to achieve. In the course of this discussion, we are now discussing the 11th out of 14 categories of mitzvot that serve towards that goal, and that is the category of korbanot, or of ritual sacrifices. The Rambam's overarching thesis, is that the korbanot were given to the Jewish people in order to wean them away, pull them away from idolatrous practices that that were prevalent in the times when the Torah was given. I hope that other people can hear me. I just got a message that someone's not able to hear me. I hope that that's not the case with other people. Okay, so in any event, we are continuing. We're using the Pines edition, although I do encourage others to look at the latest edition of the guide by Professor Len Goodman and others. It is a very good new translation. We are still using the Shlomo Pines edition, which is the sort of the classic one from the early 1960s. And we're on the bottom of page 586, the very last line in the Pines edition. In order to get our bearings, let me share my screen with the outline that we try to provide every week. And I find it to be very helpful in order to be able to gather my thoughts and to go over what, every point that the Rambam is trying to communicate to us, and I hope you will as well. So sort of by way of introduction, where to get our bearings as to where we are in the midst of the chapter. Until now in chapter 46, the Rambam has been providing rational explanations for the Korbanot, which is the 11th category, in the context of his thesis that the purpose of the sacrificial service is to deter man from similar idolatrous practices that were prevalent during the time when the Torah was given. At this point in the chapter, the Rambam focuses on cults who worship demons how did they worship the demons? Either through the drinking of blood, which from the animals that they would sacrifice, or the eating of meat with the drained blood in a pool or bowl in front of them. To counteract this emphasis on blood as a means of channeling demonic forces, God commanded to spill out all the blood of a sacrifice on the side of the altar, to completely discard it and remove it. After you've sprinkled a small amount of blood on the altar, you now must discard the remainder of the blood. Furthermore, all blood, including that of non-sacrifices, must be discarded, and the Rambam had demonstrated that by a verse in the Torah, that you must discard all of the blood. It was also for this reason that God forbids the eating of what's called bisar ta'ava, non-sacrificial meat, during the Jews' 40-year sojourn in the desert. And what that means is that there is a specific mitzvah in the Torah that anytime you want to eat meat, you must first bring the animal as a peace offering to the temple, offer its entrails on the altar, and then you can eat the remainder of the flesh of the animal. Why did God make that commandment to the Jews of the desert? The answer is since the desire to worship demons was still fresh in their national psyche. And this really brings us to where we are, bottom of page 586. In this context, the Rambam discusses another mitzvah that is binding not only for that initial generation of Jews who were traveling through the desert, but it's actually one of the 613 commandments that is binding upon all Jews even today, which is called the mitzvah of kisui hadam, covering the blood of certain animals that are slaughtered. It specifically applies to chayot, which are game animals, such as deer, and birds. This law does not apply to slaughtering animals which would typically be brought as a korban. So we were talking about cattle, sheep, and goats. They are not subject to this mitzvah of covering the blood. That is, after you slaughter the animal, you must take dirt or sawdust or any other kind of organic product from the soil and use it to cover the blood that has been spilled. Why did God give us this mitzvah? The prohibition of bisar ta'ava, of having non-sacrificial meat for that initial generation, precluded the Jews from utilizing blood for demonic worship. But what of non-sacrificial animals, such as game animals and birds? You can't bring a deer as a sacrifice. Most birds cannot be brought as a sacrifice, so like a chicken. So how do we prevent a person from engaging in demon worship with the blood when the animal is not being brought as a korban, as a sacrifice? For this reason, God commanded the mitzvah of kisui hadam. This mitzvah prevents people from collecting the blood and using it for cultic worship to demons. This is reflected in the verse in Parshat Ha'azinu at the very end of Deuteronomy, where the Torah says, Yizbechu la shedim lo Eloah, that the Jews in the times of the desert were still worshiping and offering sacrifices to demons that are not Eloah. Now, it's quite interesting, and I believe in the Pines edition, there's an unfortunate capitalization of the word God here. Well, I believe that's an error. The Rambam here cites a midrash that interprets this statement that the demons are not an Eloah. And the Rambam's version of that midrash, it is critical of Israel for worshiping not only real forces, such as the sun and the moon, which actually exist, but imaginary ones as well, such as shadows and demons. That's the Rambam's version. So the word Eloah means that they have no reality, because the word Eloah means strength. So it means essentially that the Rambam has a version of the midrash. We don't have this version of the midrash, but the way that the midrash of the Rambam reads the verse is that God is critical of the Jewish people by worshiping not only celestial bodies, which are real things, but also worshiping things that are purely imagined, such as demons. And this is a reflection on the lowered state of the Jewish people. When they had first left Egypt, they were still engaged in these satanic rituals. And as a result, it was necessary for God to preclude them from eating regular meat that was non-sacrificial, and also to make sure that they would cover up all blood that was ever spilled for food. However, with that said, that's not the text of the Midrash that we have. The text of the Midrash that we have is Yizbechu la shedim lo Eloah. Ilu hayu avdim lechama v'la levana la kochevim v'la mazalot v'lidvarim she'en tzorech le'olam v'hanaya le'olam bahem lo haita kina kifula. In other words, the Medrash is saying that if the Jews had only worshipped false gods that bring benefit to the world, God would be upset, but he would not be doubly upset. Elahem ovdim la devarim she'ein mitivim lahem ela miriim lahem. But instead, not only do the Jews worship these idolatrous gods like the celestial bodies, but they further worship entities and forces that have a negative effect, that they are harmful to man, because madar koshel shade nichnas ba'adam v'kofeh oto, because demons enter into a person's psyche and force him to do things against his will. Now, we could, if we wanted, if we had more time, expand on this topic and talk about how psychology was viewed and psychosis was viewed in the ancient world and in the medieval world before the advent of modern psychology. The view was, from the times of the Talmud, that if a person had a fit of temporary insanity, it was because he was possessed by a demon and therefore was compelled to do things against his will. And therefore, our version of the Midrash is that people worship demonic forces that actually cause harm to man. And God says, why would you do that? I could understand if you were to worship the sun or the moon, they bring benefit to the world. But why would you worship a force that only brings injury and harm to the human experience? And that's the criticism according to our version of the Midrash. It should be obvious by now why the Rambam cannot coexist with a version of the Medrash the way we have it, because the Rambam did not believe in the existence of Shedim, of demons. And we've spent a lot of time on this in previous chapters where we demonstrated that the Rambam was taken to task by people like the Vilna Gaon and later commentaries for his what was viewed to be over-rational view of the occult or of the spiritual realm. But the fact is, the Rambam says that in his version of the Medrash, the criticism of the Jews is that they were steeped in demonic worship, and that these demons are completely imaginary, they're not real. So back to our discussion. In contrast with the mitzvah of Kisui Hadam, the prohibition of Bisar Ta'ava only applied during those 40 years while the Jews were traveling in the desert. And he gives us three reasons why the prohibition of eating Bisar Ta'ava, non-sacrificial meat, only applied during that first generation. It was because it was held that demons only had dominion in desert places and were not prevalent in populated areas like cities. So once the Jewish people entered the land of Canaan, demons were no longer a thing for the Jewish people because they were no longer in the desert, and therefore there was no need to clamp down so hard on averting demonic rituals. Secondly, by the time they reached Eretz Yisrael 40 years later, the desire for demon worship was by that time quite diminished because the Jews had gone through an entire generation of Torah study. And the third reason, and the final reason the Rambam gives, is that it would have been very difficult for people to abide by this law that would require them to make pilgrimages for long distances every time they wanted to eat meat. So let's say, a man comes home one day, says, "I'd like to do a barbecue. Let's go get some meat and put it on the Barbie." And his wife would say, "Well, you can't. You can only bring meat, an animal as a sacrifice, and only then can you eat from the flesh of the animal. So you got to schlep all the way. We live in Haifa. How are we going to? It's going to take us a week to get to Yerushalayim if we leave today. Is it worth it to have a barbecue?" And that would create a lot of resentment, and it wasn't practical to perpetuate the prohibition of Bisar Ta'ava according to the Rambam. And although the Rambam doesn't say it, this third and final reason would certainly explain the contrast between the temporary prohibition of Bisar Ta'ava, and the permanent prohibition or the permanent requirement for Kisui Hadam, of covering the blood. This is not considered to be an excessive burden on man, that every time you want to slaughter a chicken, you have to cover its blood in some dirt or sawdust. This is done routinely in slaughterhouses all over the world. And it's done quite easily, and it takes very little time. And so therefore the mitzvah is binding even to this day, where demon worship is significantly reduced, and therefore the concern about utilizing blood for idolatry is not as prevalent. But nevertheless, the mitzvah remains. And now the Rambam departs from that discussion of blood and the use of blood in demonic worship, and he talks about giving us a general rule about the choice of animals that the Torah designates for particular sins. And the Rambam tells us a fascinating general rule that he has derived from his observation of certain patterns of sacrifices throughout the Torah. His rule is that the more onerous the sin, the lowlier the animal chosen to atone for it. Let me just make sure we all understand that statement. If a person commits an abject sin, then God will prescribe that the way to atone for that sin is to bring an animal of lowly status. If a person is perhaps guilty of committing a sin that is not as onerous or is not as horrific, then the atonement will be with an animal that is a little bit more honorable or is considered to be a bit more important. Similarly, the Rambam's rule is that even if a person has committed a really bad or abject sin, if that person has a higher status within society, God will honor that individual by requiring him to bring an atonement with an animal of a higher status. So if a person commits an abject sin, a really, really bad sin, he'll have to bring a lowlier animal, unless the person has certain status within society which will mitigate the nature of the lowliness of that animal that he has to bring. So this is in, so when one, so here we go. Here's some examples. When one unintentionally commits idolatry, idolatry is the most abject act of sin that a person could potentially commit. It is an outright insurrection against God himself, and therefore it rises to the level of being like the worst possible sin. It's like one of the three cardinal sins. And therefore, the chatas offering, if a person does it unintentionally and he wishes to atone for that act, may only be a she goat, a female goat. This is in contrast with other unintentional sin offerings, where the animal may be either a she goat or a female sheep. Now, why specifically a female to atone for a serious crime for which a person must bring a korban chatat? Let me also preface by saying that you bring a korban chatat for a whole category of serious unintentional crimes. Generally, the rule is that if it's a davar shezidono karet, that if you do the sin intentionally, you would get karet, which is a spiritual excommunication from God, a high level sin. Then if you did it unintentionally, you would have to atone with a korban chatat. Now, normally a korban chatat, a sin offering, can either be a she goat or it can be a sheep. But if it's idolatry, which is really bad, it's the worst of the worst, so then it can only be a she goat. The female is considered the more inferior within the species, and the goat is considered the most inferior of all sacrificial animals. Now, it's important to note that the Rambam doesn't tell us why he believes this to be true. I don't have any explanation, but I can only conjecture. I can suggest that the female is considered to be inferior to the male of the species because she is dominated by the male. So that sort of certainly gives her lower status even in the animal kingdom among most species of animals. Why is a goat of lower status than a cow or a sheep? I can only conjecture that it's because the productivity of an animal and its importance to the farm is based on what it can produce. A cow produces milk, a sheep produces fleece, but a goat produces neither. And therefore, it might be useful perhaps maybe for a small amount of goat milk. It may be productive perhaps to be able to help pull things or to schlep things, but it doesn't have the same level of productivity and production as a cow or a sheep. So that's why it's the lowliest animal on the farm, the female goat, and that's why it is brought for the lowliest, most abject sin. Accordingly, when one is of greater importance, the animal designated for his atonement is of a higher rank. Thus, if the king commits an unintentional sin, his animal is upgraded from a she goat to a he goat because he's a king. And as I mentioned, that would be the exception to the rule that even if the king commits a really bad sin like idolatry, he atones through bringing a male instead of a female goat. When the Sanhedrin or high priest commit a sin, there are actually two errors that they've committed. Number one, they've done the sinful act itself. And number two, they've issued an erroneous legal ruling, and both the Sanhedrin and the high priest represent the authority of the law. And therefore, it represents a sin of a higher sophistication because it's not only a commission of a physical mistake, but it's also the commission of an intellectual mistake. And we know that for the Rambam, the intellect is of a higher rank than the body. And as such, when a person makes an error with the intellect and issues that and makes it known publicly, then he's committed a sin of a higher rank, so to speak, or of a higher level of sophistication. Accordingly, their sin offering for when the Sanhedrin or the high priest commit a sin is a bull, an animal of higher distinction. The exception being is if the Sanhedrin erroneously instructs the nation to commit an act of idolatry, then their animal is lowered to a he goat because idolatry, as we mentioned before, is the worst of the worst. Now we go and we apply this to other types of korbanot, not the korban chatat, but another kind of sin offering called the korban asham, which is usually translated as a guilt offering. It is usually because the nature of the sin is lower than the sin for which one brings a chatat offering. An example from which we're going to derive the psukim is the case of a person who comes in contact ritual impurity with tum'ah and then handles sacrificial items or enters the temple. And he does so by accident. In those situations, instead of bringing a korban chatat, he brings a korban asham. What he's done is a sin. It's bad, but it doesn't rise to the badness of something for which you would bring a korban chatat. Accordingly, the animal is not as lowly for an asham and can be either a ram or a male lamb. So now we're getting into sheep, right? Which is an animal of a higher rank on the farm. Note that the animal is of greater importance and its gender is male. Now, the burnt offering that an individual can offer to bring voluntarily does come to atone for some type of sin many times, but it's not of a physical nature, but it's only of a mental nature. We know that our sages tell us that the korban ola in general atones for sinful thoughts. It's completely burnt, it's not brought for any explicit sin, and it's entirely consecrated to God, and thus it is a male animal. It may only be a male animal and not a female animal, again showing that the nature of whatever it's coming to atone for is not as serious as those sins for which the atoning animal is a female. Now we talk about the mincha. A person can bring a korban mincha either voluntarily or to atone for certain sins, where the Torah gives an option that when the person is poor, instead of bringing an animal, he can bring a flour offering instead. If that's the type of korban, and there's also the type of korban mincha that a sotah must bring, a suspected adulteress, it may not have any added incense, oils, or frankincense, which the Torah does allow to be added to a flour offering if it is being brought as a gift offering. But if it's being brought to atone for sin or suspected adultery, so then it doesn't have anything added to it which would enhance its quality. And that's because these flour offerings represent the lowliness of the sinner. The sota flour offering is even more debased than the regular sin offering mincha, in that it was comprised of barley flour, an inferior grain to wheat. And this is all detailed in the Torah. But the Rambam is looking at the psukim, giving his interpretation, which he says is wonderfully meaningful. Zed davar nifla, he says. It's an amazing interpretation. He's very proud of his understanding of this pattern that he sees in the verses, that the lower the sin, the lower the rank of the animal is on the farm. And that goes to the flour offering as well. The offering of bulls for sin offerings on both the 8th day of the Mishkan's consecration, as recorded in Parshat Shemini, and on Yom Kippur. In both instances, the sages from the Midrash Tanchuma teach that these animals atone for the sin of the golden calf, and so the same species as the calf was brought to atone for. As a matter of fact, the Torah in Parshat Shemini, talking about the bull that was brought, describes it as an egel. And the word egel really means a calf, even when in reality it's a full-grown bull. The Medrash notes this, and it says that here God deliberately wanted to allude to the fact that in some way the Mishkan and its consecration by the Kohanim was a way of atoning for the sin of the golden calf. And similarly, on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol, who enters into the Holy of Holies, brings as his atoning sacrifice for both himself and all of the Kohanim, all of the descendants of Aaron, a bull as a atoning sin offering, because Aaron was complicit in the sin of the golden calf. Using the sage's commentary logically, the Rambam suggests that the reasons why so many communal sin offerings brought on Rosh Chodesh, the festivals, etc., are goats, is because the most prevalent sin among the desert generation was the worship of demons, as we started this morning with. The demon is represented by the goat, as the Torah had said, "V'lo yizbechu od et zivcheim lasi'irim." Let them not worship their sacrifices anymore to the se'irim, which translates both as goats and demons. We talked a little bit about the mythological satyr and how even in all other ancient cultures, the demon or the satanic entity was in some way connected to the goat, and that's true even in modern mythology as well. And so that's the reason why when the Jewish people have to bring a korban musaf or a korban chatat, a sin offering on Rosh Chodesh, on the Chagim, and so forth, on Rosh Hashanah and so forth, they are commonly goats because it was to atone for those sins that were performed to the goat-like demonic entities that people worshipped during the desert period. But then he says, I want to draw your attention to something else that the sages teach, which is also quite viable, which is that these goat offerings are reminiscent of the sin of Joseph's brothers, who dipped his tunic into the blood of a goat. It's, if you recall, it says in the Torah, Vayishchetu seir izim, the brothers slaughtered a goat, and they dipped Yosef's multicolored coat in the blood to present a charade to their father Yaakov that Yosef had been mauled by a wild animal and was dead. And as Rashi tells us in one of the times where the Torah in Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, tells us that there is an atoning sacrifice at the time of the consecration of the Mishkan of a Seir Izim, which appears repeatedly when the Nesiim, when the presidents of each tribe would bring their preliminary sacrifice to inaugurate the altar. There was always a Seir Izim Echad Lechatat, a goat that was brought as a sin offering. And Rashi says, quoting Chazal, Lechaper al Mechirat Yosef, this is to atone for Yosef's sale. This too is a legitimate reason, says the Rambam, for at the end of the day, the purpose of the specific animal is to remind the sinner of his sin so as to help him repent and atone for the sin. The way to attain forgiveness is to commit an act, and this is the sort of the outgrowth where the Rambam basically gives us this general rule. How do you attain forgiveness and atonement for a sin you've committed? Is to commit an act of obedience, which is of the same kind as the previous sinful disobedience. So if I do something positive, which is of the same nature as the thing that was negative, and I turn the negative into a positive, that's the most direct and effective way of achieving atonement. If one sinned, for example, with his property, one must atone by expending his property for virtue. If one sinned with corporeal pleasure, let's say he engaged in improper eating or improper sexual activity, one must weaken his physical body through fasting and sleeplessness. If one sinned through acting immorally, one must submit himself to the opposite extreme of moral behavior. And I think here he's meaning that if one, let's say, cheated others and exploited others unfairly. And he says, I have explained this principle in Hilchot Deot. It's a very famous line from the Rambam in the laws of proper attitudes and proper thoughts. He says, the Rambam starts off by saying that if a person had a proclivity towards sinful behavior, he's got to go to the other extreme in order to recalibrate himself so that he ends up in the middle. He says, Va'al kav ze ya'aseh b'shar kol hadeot, im hu rachok lekitzei ha'echad. If a person is distant to one extreme of negative behavior, yarchik atzmo lekatzeh hasheni, he should push himself to the other extreme. If a person is given to anger, he should push himself to the other extreme where he doesn't allow anything to anger him. V'yinhog bo zman rav, comporting himself for an extended period of time as the person who never gets angry, ad shiachzor lo bo l'derech hatova, until he somehow ends up back in the middle. V'hi midah benonit shebechol de'ah v'de'ah, and explains the Rambam that this is how you achieve the Shvil HaZahav, the golden path of the middle, in every single moral trait or character or behavior trait. If one sins through incorrect speculation, he continues, believing in an incorrect belief, then he must suppress those thoughts and should instead redirect his thoughts toward what ought to be believed. Similar, very consistent. And he says, I have discussed this idea at the beginning of Moreh Nevukhim, in the first section, both in chapter 5 and in chapter 32, that sometimes hasty and sloppy thought without the proper mental preparation can lead to erroneous ideas and conclusions. One who is not properly initiated should desist and must desist from such endeavors, lest he comes to faulty conclusions. And if you recall from section 1, chapter 32, the Rambam had a lengthy discussion about Elisha ben Abuya, the man who entered into the orchard of deep speculation and exited a heretic. And it's in that context that he talks about the story in Parshat Ki Tisa of the youth who allowed their gaze to look at God inappropriately at a time when they were not yet prepared to understand these very, very esoteric and deeply philosophical concepts of the divine, and therefore they were considered to be sinners. But that's a tangent, bringing us back to the realm of Korbanot, where God specifically chooses the very animal that a person sinned with, or the symbol to atone. It's very consistent with what he's saying now. This is the reason why Aaron and his descendants were commanded to bring a bull as a sin offering on Yom Kippur to remind them of Aaron's sin with the golden calf. It is also the reason why the Jewish nation's sin offering is a goat to atone for their sin of selling their brother Yosef into slavery. Through this sacrificial regimen, the sinner is saved a much more difficult path towards forgiveness. These acts serve to deter any future disobedience as well. Let's go on because we're running out of time. Let's now talk about the sin offering on Rosh Chodesh. I will see fit to call your attention here to a very strange matter, though its external meaning does not pertain to the purpose of this treatise. And the Rambam uses that sentence to introduce the following question. There is only one time in all of Parshat Pinchas, which talks about the periodic special offerings brought on the Sabbath, Rosh Chodesh, and festivals, where the Torah talks about a seir izim as a chatat, but that's common to all of the above. But what's unusual about Rosh Chodesh, it says useir izim echad lechatat ladoshem, that it's for God. And the difficulty that the Rambam has is that a sin offering is not exclusively for God, because part of the animal is consumed by the Kohanim. You take the entrails of the animal, its intestinal fats, you sprinkle its blood on the altar, you burn the innards on the altar, and then the Kohanim eat the meat of the sin offering as a way, as participating in the atonement process for the sins of the Jewish people on the Sabbath, on Rosh Chodesh, and on festivals. Why then does the Torah use the word for Rosh Chodesh, lechatat lashem, if it's not really exclusively for God? That would only be a term that's used for a burnt offering that is completely burnt on the altar, but not for a sin offering, a chatat. Why then is Rosh Chodesh different? And the Rambam's thesis is because it might be misunderstood that the chatat on Rosh Chodesh is a sacrifice to the moon, such as was offered by the Copts of Egypt at the beginning of the months. It was explicitly stated that this goat was consecrated to God and not to the moon. Because Rosh Chodesh marks a celestial event of the new phase of the moon, one might incorrectly interpret the offering as a sacrifice to the moon gods, and therefore, in order to make sure that it's not, the Torah says, chatat ladoshem, even though the Kohanim are going to be eating part of it, but don't make a mistake and think that this is for the moon gods instead of for God. Now, I just want to point out parenthetically that if you look at Rashi in the book of Numbers, chapter 28, verse 15, and there, which is this discussion of the sin offering on Rosh Chodesh, Rashi brings us two reasons as to why the word Lashem appears there. The first reason is a halachic reason to atone for a sinner who did not know that he was entering the temple in a state of impurity. That's a halachic issue. And the second reason, he says, based on a midrash agada, an agadic midrash, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu haviu kapara alai al shemi'atati yatayarecha. A fascinating idea that God says the reason why this is a sin offering for God is that I, God, must atone for having done something wrong on Rosh Chodesh by causing the moon to shrink and have to renew itself constantly. Because as we know, based on the Midrash in Parshat Bereshit, initially the moon was the same size as the sun. It was not waxing and waning constantly, but was constant like the sun. God switched the moon, caused it to wax and wane as a way of reducing the stature of the moon. And God says, I harmed the moon, and therefore I must atone for sin. Not a subject for now, a fascinating discussion. I would refer you to the Zohar on this topic, and the Sefer Mei HaShiloach also has a very fascinating discussion on this very topic, not for now. Now, let's go on because we're running out of time. The Rambam now talks about the idea of what is a reach nichoach lashem, something that serves as a savory fragrance to God. And the basic question that he deals with is, why would we think that a sin offering provides a savory fragrance for God? And so the Rambam says that the reason for this is because when either an individual or a congregation offers an animal to God, God is pleased with that offering based on the Rambam's overarching thesis about the purpose of Korbanot, which is to deter people from idolatry. If I go ahead and I take an animal that I would have previously, had I not been given the Torah, I would have previously offered this animal for idolatry, and I instead offer it on the altar in the Mishkan or the temple to God instead, then God says, this is so pleasing to me that you've got it right and you're not following idolatry. This is what causes a savory fragrance for God. But there is a subcategory of korbanot where the Torah says, I don't want the carcass of the animal to burn on the altar because this animal will not provide a savory fragrance, because the function of this atoning korban is in order to represent an elimination of a particular sin that the community has committed. So therefore, he writes, when an error occurs in judgment, let's say the example is, one of the two examples is where the Sanhedrin makes an error and they instruct the nation to commit something which turns out to be a horrible sin. The Torah prescribes a special korban that the Sanhedrin must bring on behalf of the entire community to atone for their erroneous uh, sacrifice, commission of sin. The objective of the korban is to signify that this act will completely disappear and will never resurface among the people again. Its burning does not offer the same savory fragrance, the same nachas to God, and instead needs to disappear completely, just as the behavior for which it is coming to atone. And that is why the Torah prescribes for that particular kind of korban that instead of burning the carcass on the altar, you must take the carcass, take it outside the camp of the Temple Mount, take it outside of Jerusalem, and burn it outside to represent that the sin for which that is being atoned for is completely disappearing. No longer is this a nachas for God, a savory fragrance that represents the moving away from idolatry, but rather this korban represents the disappearance of a sin that was erroneously committed by the entire Jewish community. And in a similar vein, the mincha of the sota is also not something that God wants to be burnt on the altar to produce a savory fragrance. It's instead maskeret avon. It reminds God of sin, and it is in no way pleasing to God. Now, an even greater representation of this idea that there are certain kinds of sacrificial offerings that are removed from the temple confines and are moved as far away from God as possible to represent a distancing of the symbolism of this korban from God is the ultimate practice of that idea, which takes place on Yom Kippur when we send the goat out to Azazel. The goat goes out to the wilderness because it represents the entire sin, the entire body of sins of the entire Jewish people over this past year. It therefore received no treatment at all on the altar, nor was it even ritually slaughtered. Instead, it had to be distanced as far as possible to a cut-off land, Eretz Gezerah. No one is naive to think that the goat was literally carrying the sins of the Jews on its back. Rather, this metaphor serves as a visual lesson. The Rambam is very insightful in how the korban is supposed to provide a visual and psychological lesson to the observer, and that is to bring forth a form in the soul so that a passion toward repentance should result. The idea being is that we have freed ourselves by sending this goat away. We have freed ourselves from all our previous actions, cast them behind our backs, and remove them to an extreme distance. The next thing, and we just have a little bit more to go, we're almost at the end of the chapter. The Rambam now discusses wine libations, and they're a bit of a mystery to the Rambam. Just like earlier in the chapter, or actually in chapter 45, the Rambam was puzzled by the showbread table and the showbread, why it exists. The Rambam has a similar way of saying, I just am clueless, I am stymied, why the Torah would say that you should pour libations on the altar. And again, it's because the Rambam's whole thesis is that sacrificial service is supposed to deter us from idolatry. So we're supposed to do things that are quite different from the way things were done in idolatrous shrines for the worship of their gods. Why then does God tell us to pour wine on the altar, which is the exact way that the idolatrous nations would worship their idols? And he writes, no reason for this has occurred to me. Very much in the same vein that he talks about the showbread table, for which, we also explained over there that the showbread does not fit neatly into the Rambam's thesis that the whole purpose of the temple was to rise above physicality when the bread is actually something very physical. And in the same vein, the Rambam doesn't understand wine libation, and he says someone else gave the following reason. He doesn't even want to associate himself with the reason, but he says, I'll offer it anyway. The best way to placate lust, which is seated in the organ of the liver, is with meat. This was the medieval belief. The best way to placate the animal soul, which is seated in the heart, is with wine. The best way to placate the intellect soul, which is seated in the brain, is with music. For this reason, the Korbanot are comprised of meat, wine, and song, which is the Levites would sing as the Korbanot are being brought, and they are comprised of meat and wine, because meat and wine, when used responsibly, can suppress certain negative drives that exist within man, and that's why God wants wine to be poured on the altar, to represent that I am channeling all of my negative drives towards doing something positive in the service of God. That could be, he says, the reason, but he's equivocating and he's not committing to the answer by saying this is somebody else's explanation. And finally, why does God want us to make regular pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem? Because this will bring about a rejuvenation of Torah study and observance, as happens whenever people gather for a holy purpose. And I like to cite the Khatam Sofer in his discussion of the custom that arose just a couple of centuries ago, that people would make a pilgrimage to the town of Meron on Lag BaOmer and burn bonfires. The Khatam Sofer says there is absolutely no tradition for this, and there is absolutely no logical reason. But then he also says, very interestingly, that whenever Jews gather for a holy objective, that's a wonderful thing. So that's enough of a reason to celebrate the behavior that is not well sourced or documented in anything historical. And the Rambam seems to be saying a similar idea. He says, when Jews get together for a holy objective, then they will only be enhanced spiritually through that commingling, through that coming together, through that incorporation of ideas and thoughts and Torah study and so forth. And that's the objective. God wants Jews to come together periodically so that we will strengthen each other. This is especially true for the once every 7 year mitzvah of Hakhel, which is done over the holiday of Sukkot once every 7 years after the Shemitah year. This strengthens the resolve of everyone present to follow in God's ways. And that's why they read the Sefer Torah in the presence of the entire nation. When people would make a pilgrimage, they would bring with them multiple goods and funds. And that's another benefit, which is they would bring their Meiser Sheni tithe, their 4th-year tithe, what's called Neta Revai, their 10th animal tithe, which is called Maaser Behema. They were thus laden with cash, meat, and wine. This would invariably end up being a surplus of goods, which they couldn't possibly consume in Jerusalem over the course of 7 days. And this necessitated the giving of charity to the poor during these pilgrimages. And this is clearly desired by God. This is a secondary benefit that is achieved through making pilgrimages while bringing various goods with you, because the Torah says, "V'samachta b'chagecha," you shall rejoice on your holiday, "Ata uvincha uvitecha ve'avdecha ve'amatecha," you, your son, your daughter, your servant, your handmaid, "V'halevi v'hager v'hayatom," and the Levite, the convert, the orphan, the ha'almana, and the widow that is in your gates, meaning that you will provide benefit to even the lowest echelons of Jewish society, people who need charity, and that is desirable to God. And that's a secondary reason why God wants us to make a pilgrimage, bringing various goods with us. And as he concludes the chapter, he says, we have now dealt with each of the commandments belonging to this category of korbanot, and with many of their particulars. And the Rambam feels that he's given very rational, reasonable explanations to so many of the details of Korbanot. We're going to leave it here, my friends. We have maybe time for one question if anyone has a very simple question. If not, I'm going to call it a day. And Bezrat Hashem, we will tackle the 12th category out of the 14 in chapter 47 next week. Looking forward to
I
seeing
have a question in the chat.
Yes, please. A question in the chat. Okay, let's take a quick look. Doesn't it also say in the Torah, for blood is life, as a reason not to eat blood? Yes, it does. But for the Rambam, especially when people were worshiping demons with blood, he doesn't want any kind of sacrificial service to be associated with blood. Again, where the korbanot are meant to deter man from similar kinds of cultic practices that involved blood, that were associated with idolatry, the Rambam says, therefore, that blood is completely removed from the sacrificial offering of man. And it extends, he says, not negating what you're offering, Elaine, but at the same time saying that this is a deterrence against demonic ritual. Now, he doesn't really have a comprehensive explanation as to why God wants blood to be used to be sprinkled on the altar. That would probably be because the blood contains the soul of the animal, and the animal is a surrogate for man. But the Rambam sort of sidesteps that whole issue, doesn't get into the blood, and sort of minimizes blood worship completely from the Jewish practice. Okay, everyone have a wonderful week. Hope to see you next time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.